All right, we'll get this going without Rich. So I'd like to call this meeting into order. So I'd like to make a motion to open up our special meeting at 3:05 p.m.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. So we'd like to introduce Carrie Gallagher from the DEC, and I wanted to thank the members of the Lake Agawam Conservancy we have here today, and thank you everyone for attending. Carrie, you can take it from here.
Yeah, thank you for having us, and it's great to meet some of the trustees who've not been able to participate in the meetings today, because I think, Kimberly's been at meetings, Jesse, you've been at meetings, so it's, if Rich shows up, then we'll have everyone. We'll have seen, have been involved. And I feel like everyone just shifted over from town hall, so. We just gave the same presentation 2 hours ago. But yes, Carrie Gallagher, Regional Director here from New York State DEC. I did just want to point out, I have Karen Steinbrook and Kelly Reynolds. They're from our central office team. They actually work on harmful algal blooms statewide. They've been instrumental in working with us. And then I have a number of my regional staff here, Tony Leung, my regional water engineer, Kevin Jennings, our regional freshwater wetlands manager, Alyssa Carroll, who is our regional HABs coordinator. And then, of course, I think you probably know all the rest of the folks in the room. So, but just, so it's a big team, both from DEC and others who have been working on this since, essentially since October. All right, so why we're all here. We want you to adopt the Lake Agawam HAB action plan and then take steps to implement it. What does that look like? Let's see, how do I, okay, I don't know, do I do this? Nope.
Next.
Yeah, I did the, okay, there we go. So we have developed essentially through almost monthly meetings with the state DEC, the town trustees, the town board, the supervisor, the Lake Agawam Conservancy, the village clean water committee. It's been like, everyone has been sitting around the table together to come up with this action plan, which basically goes through the components, and you have a draft in front of you, the almost final draft. Gives you the overview of what's happening statewide with HABs. A big thing that's been happening, I guess I'll get to the next slide a little bit more. But essentially, these are the components you're gonna have, right? What's the statewide perspective, the background review and water quality in that particular water body, the different plan components, so the priority projects that the stakeholder group, the working group, has identified. There's both watershed projects and in-lake management projects. And then what are the next steps? So, which really, from our perspective, is an adoption of the action plan and then the role of the trustees moving with that as well as moving forward. All right, here's what we know. Blooms are common throughout New York State. This is why Governor Cuomo has started to really put a lot of resources towards addressing harmful algal blooms all across the state. All water bodies are vulnerable. Doesn't matter. Nobody's safe. No water body is safe from HABs. The blooms tend to be more common when you have lakes that have a high phosphorus and nitrogen content. There's also many different types of cyanobacteria, and the toxin levels can be highly variable. And the shoreline blooms, so blooms closer to the shore, which of course is what you would notice, are much more common than open water blooms. So in other words, it's complicated, there's no magic bullet, which is why it takes a 50-page action plan to try to address it, and why you haven't been able to solve it yet. If it was easy, you would have done so already. So what we don't know is what specifically triggers the blooms, both in where you might have low phosphorus or low nitrogen, and lakes. Why, we don't know why some high phosphorus and nitrogen lakes do not exhibit blooms, right? So it's kind of like you think because they have the high levels of those inputs, they would have big blooms, but they don't always. We don't really know yet the role of food web changes or climate change or invasive species in terms of impacting whether or not a water body will experience a bloom. We also don't know exactly how blooms form in each different type of water body. So these are questions we're going to be looking at statewide. And we're trying to then work in various different types of water bodies across the state to come up with solutions. We also, well, that's why we don't have the best strategies for mitigating blooms. That's what we want to figure out. So the contents of the action plan, there's a whole summary of the lake. Oh, I do have those one-pagers too. There's a summary of the lake, the water quality, and history of harmful algal blooms within the lake. There's a whole both water body and statewide analysis of the characteristics associated with harmful algal blooms, and then there's lake and watershed implementation projects to address the harmful algal blooms. And those are the priority projects that have been identified essentially by the team, sitting in this room. So big picture, Lake Agawam, it's a Class C water body. Its best use is for fish propagation. I guess I said fishing before, but really fish propagation I think is technically what. It's both, ranges the spectrum from mesotrophic to eutrophic. It's 64 acres in size, holds about 208 million gallons. The average depth is 10 feet, and it's just a little under a mile, 0.82 miles long. Chris, this is where we tag team. You're going to come up and explain the dots.
Okay, yeah. So this is data that my lab collected. Chris Gobler, Stony Brook University. Been monitoring Lake Agawam since 2003. So this is just sort of a snapshot of the data that was collected 2013 through 2016. And it's specifically measuring levels of microcystin, which is the toxin that is made by the blue-green algae in the lake. That's why we're concerned about these blue-green algae blooms. They do make toxins, and microcystin is a gastrointestinal toxin. It's been affirmed as a probable carcinogen, and that's why EPA has set standards for it in drinking water. They've also set recreational standards. The recreational standard for any lake is actually 4 micrograms per liter. It's hard to find a number that is below that in this chart if you look at it carefully. And so this is why we need to address this issue. It's a human health hazard. Dogs have died on the eastern Long Island, Georgia Pond, and other places dogs have gotten sick. And so it's a threat to human health, to animal health. We even worry about potential for it being made airborne, and so that's the prime motivation for mitigating these blooms.
Thanks, Chris. So we're very fortunate that we have all the data that Dr. Gobler and his lab have been collecting for years. These are the most recent years of data where you were working with DEC. Do you want to explain anything here, Chris, or is it just mostly?
It's pretty self-explanatory. The
Right.
DEC, we started reporting our data to the DEC in 2013.
Oh, he needs to talk to the mic.
Mike, yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Anyway, since 2013, we've been collaborating with the DEC, reporting our data there. If you look at the numbers, specifically the last 4 columns, in some cases, it looks like things are getting worse each year. It's more, actually, this is more reflective of us, over at least this time frame, collaborating even better with the DEC. And you should know, I said this earlier today, but it's true that New York State has the best monitoring program for blue-green algae in the country. They have 62 counties they're looking at, and they're looking very carefully at all the water bodies in all the county. And in Suffolk County, I report out to the DEC every Friday, spring through fall, on exactly where the blue-green algae blooms are. And so what's being shown here is these are based on the numbers that get reported from my lab to the DEC, and they then make public announcements. But the bottom line is the blooms start in the spring, and they go through typically all the way into the fall, sometimes even into the winter. So they're very persistent, but they're worse in the summer, which is when most people are in and around the lake. Again, motivation for mitigating.
Right. So basically, we're just, you know this, you know why we need to be doing it, but this is really showing you the science behind it. This is looking at, in particular, just a breakdown, a pie chart of the percentage of the types of land use in the watershed. And again, the watershed, as you can see, goes pretty far north. There's Lake Agawam and then all the way north. So it's about a 1,400 acre total watershed, which is why we were speaking to the town trustees earlier today. And it's very important that the entire, that the town is involved as well, because as you can see, the village all on its own cannot completely solve and address the problem of inputs into Lake Agawam that could be contributing to the harmful algal blooms. And these are in, you can read them probably more easily in the report, in the plan. And again, this is a breakout more more specifically on different types of land use. Then we have, this is something that Dr. Gobler felt was important to highlight, is when you look at phosphorus loading in Lake Agawam, it's not just the watershed inputs, but if you look at that arrow on the bottom, you can also see the sediment flux. So that's why you have all of these nutrients that have been coming into the lake and getting deposited in the sediments in the bottom, and then they just sit there, and as they get released back into the water column, they cause new problems. So unless that is addressed long-term, you're always going to have nutrients from the sediment being released into the water body. And then you have the nitrogen loading aspect of it as well. You can see septic density in the kind of the map, again showing how far north in the watershed things go that would be impacting Lake Agawam, and why there's a need for a larger picture collaboration to address the concerns. But if you see if you add up, and this was very helpful, Chris, I like these little diagrams. Yeah, so wastewater coming from Main Street and wastewater coming from the other side, 49%, 20%, you're up to almost 70% of your loading, nitrogen loading is coming from wastewater. So that's definitely a big concern that needs to be addressed. And again, the sediment flux, so there's some bound up in the sediment that's going to continuously be released unless it's addressed as well. So, as we mentioned in the beginning, really with the input from experts, so DC kind of helped facilitate pulling this together. We're the technical advisors. We're going to be a resource throughout the process. We have our academic partner with Dr. Gobler, SUNY Stony Brook School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences in his lab, doing all the data collection and sampling and analysis and scientific analysis as we move forward. Of course, we have Lake Agawam Conservancy, so folks living in the community that is most directly impacted by by the blooms themselves. And we have, we have my whole team, but we have the town trustees, the town board, all engaged in obviously the village, which has been doing a lot of work over the years already to try to reduce runoff and impacts to the lake, and will be continuing to do so. So it was really all of us working together, again, collaboratively over the last 5 to 6 months that we got to this point. And we came up with some action plan priorities. We really broke them down into short, midterm, and long-term timeframes, and we did keep the timeframes the same as what we were kind of doing statewide. Again, the idea is when you do a plan like this, you want to have a template that's fairly similar to what you would have for other water bodies around the state. So, for example, when the village or the town wanted to apply for funding potentially to implement one of these action plan priorities, we would be able to the reviewers, which could be New York State DC or EFC, would be comparing apples to apples in terms of the plans and what the priority projects look like. So it's really between 0 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, and 5 to 10 years. And again, it looks at those two categories: watershed management, so what are the inputs from the watershed that influence and support HABs, and then in-lake management itself, which would be to really try to address some of those internal stressors that contribute to blooms in the lake. So here's what we hope to address collectively with the action plan priorities, right? Nitrogen inputs associated with septic system discharge and other wastewater discharge. Internal loading of legacy nutrients from in-lake sediments. That was that sediment flux where you saw the arrows in the bottoms of those nice kind of cartoon diagrams. And then non-point source nutrient inputs from the contributing watershed. And again, that could be stormwater runoff and other types of runoff, pet waste, things that just get into the water body from that entire collective watershed. So some of the watershed strategies, if we look specifically at the on-site septic systems, these are two examples, and Chris, you'll remember the names since you added these. But essentially first, one of the things that we've talked about is on the short-term priorities, completing a groundwater study of Lake Agawam, right? So really getting a sense of how groundwater flows, from what direction, what time of year, what are the inputs coming from the groundwater at the different sources and the different areas around the lake. Trying to continue with the voluntary septic replacements. And I know Megan and Pat, that's something you're going to be talking about at your upcoming seminar, so that's great. And evaluating a permeable reactive barrier for nitrogen reduction. And I'll just keep going, and if there are questions, we can come back. Stormwater management, so how do you reduce the inputs from runoff before they get to the lake? Buffer planting, again, I know Pat and Megan are going to be talking about that as well at their upcoming seminar. This idea of floating wetlands and bioswales, I know that was something that you were just speaking with the town trustees about. There's another bioswale plans. And then how do you maybe possibly do nutrient binding and sediment, control sediment runoff, so that would be binding the nutrients actually in the lake. Internal loading in lake management options. So one of the things that the village has started, and they just got a grant to continue work on this, is looking at the sediment in the lake bottom, because you need to fully understand what the sediments are comprised of before you could even enter into a dredging plan. And of course you have to figure out dewatering, but depending on what is in those sediments will determine whether the material can be beneficially reused or whether it has to be disposed of some other fashion, like in a landfill, or even off-island in a hazardous waste landfill. Aeration technologies, and I know some of this has been tried as well. So looking at maybe center of the lake aeration as well as some more nano bubbling technologies. And Chris, jump in at any time if there's something. I was going to say this slide in particular because you have experience with looking at this. So these are two of the action items that were considered potential short-term priorities that could be implemented as soon as this HAB season. And that was after a lot of discussion and back and forth, looking at a lot of topics. And one is the use of hydrogen peroxide, which is a chemical treatment, but it does break down into just water and oxygen. It is known to be effective. It hasn't been used tremendously frequently yet in New York State, but Chris might be able to talk a little bit about his experience in Roth Pond on Stony Brook campus. And really, the goal is that it would help. It wouldn't eliminate, but it would help to essentially suppress the blooms or reduce the amount of blooms that you saw this season. And the thinking is that on its own, it wouldn't be effective enough, but maybe if we couple it with testing ultrasonic devices, which is something that New York State is interested in piloting as a technology. We've done some limited pilots on smaller water bodies, and the idea is this would be an opportunity to test it out on a water body like this in combination with the hydrogen peroxide. We have not seen yet, we didn't see impacts on fish species. So that would be the primary concern, is if something like an ultrasonic device had non-target impacts. So far, the data is promising, but it really needs to be tested more broadly and at a larger scale. So this was kind of the thinking for this season, potentially, for the lake. And that is pretty much it. The role of stakeholders, wrap up, questions. What we would like is for their trustees and all the stakeholders. The key here is it has to be locally driven, right? So whatever solutions are chosen to be implemented, the community has to be behind it. We're here as a technical resource, but we're not the answer to what you should do. We can help advise. We can help you get the permits. We can help you, we can help with all of that piece, but it really has to be the village, the conservancy, the town. You guys have to all come together and agree that, yep, we want to move forward with these items this year. Here's our very specific, now detailed plan. We would need a HABs mitigation plan, so you have the action plan that we want adopted. Then to actually implement anything, there's a much more detailed, narrow, focused mitigation plan that would have to be submitted that would specify this treatment technology implemented in this fashion over this time period, with sampling and analysis that, again, we want to rope Chris in and make sure that he stays on board with doing all that sampling and analysis so we have consistency. We also trust the work he does, so we know that it'll be good quality. And then we would, of course, be here to help you with any of the permitting needs and concerns. So I think with that, is it just thank you? Yes. Chris, did you want to add anything, or Karen or Kelly, anything you want to add? Or we'll just see if there are questions?
I think so.
Anyone from the Conservancy want to add anything?
We will after we,
Okay.
I'll add something.
Thank you, David.
I'm David Bonnet. I'm a board member of the Lake Agawam Conservancy. I'm also a co-founder of the predecessor group to the Lake Agawam Conservancy. I've been in this room many times over at least 12 or 15 years looking to address issues with Lake Agawam. I've lived on Lake Agawam for 20 years. Very, very much appreciate the village support over many years, particularly with the storm drain improvements. And that's probably one of the most significant things the village has done, is working in conjunction with grant writers as you've seen different storm drain improvement areas over the years, that's really helped mitigate the runoff from the roads, so that's been helpful. All of the bubblers in the lake that have been put in over the years have been extremely helpful as well. But now it's time to take action. And the Conservancy is an official 501c3 organization. We are here as a part of a strong public-private partnership. We can certainly raise funds to help support many of these efforts. As a matter of fact, we raised funds for the very first plan with Nelson, Pope, and Voorhees over a dozen years ago. So our recommendation and our strong consensus is the two items that were presented by Carrie, the hydrogen peroxide and the sonic treatment, are something that we need and ought to do this year. Those are clearly stated, those are clearly laid out. We have the ability to fund it, monitor it, to address what has come to be a very dire situation with the lake. So I have fellow members of the Conservancy here. We've had a number of seminars. So Megan, why don't you come up and talk about the seminars we've done?
Thank you for having us today. I'm Megan Nadashi Magyar. I think you know the Lake Agawam Conservancy has sponsored one and is planning another for April 3rd, free and open to the public seminar at Southampton Arts Center. And the focus of these seminars is to teach people what they can do at home to reduce water pollution. And it's very simple things like not using nitrogen-laden fertilizers and using compost tea instead. We're trying to give people alternatives. So it's not just say no, but this is what you can do instead. And this will help the whole environment, not just the water, but the air we breathe, the animals around us. So that's one thing. The April 3rd event will focus on septics and residential septic upgrades and getting people to understand they will get rebates for this right now. So it's a good time to take advantage of that. And we want feedback from the community about other events we should plan so that we can continue to educate the public. But this really is, the Lake Agawam Conservancy is about bringing everybody in the community together, not just the village, but the whole watershed, and learning what we can do. And we want to be an educational branch as well. So we really appreciate your support. And we're very excited about bioswales. That's been something everybody's been talking about. Gary's looked at spots. We've got a great spot now with the town that we're looking at. So on the perimeter of the lake and the south end. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for really fun, positive things with your support, which we appreciate so much. So thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Did you want to come and talk about the Linden Lane, or should we save that for another?
I can see it.
Okay.
I love it.
Okay.
Were there any questions? I know something that came up with the town trustees was talking about having a joint public hearing between the town trustees and the village trustees to allow for public comment and input before both bodies would support a resolution, adopting the plan.
I'm all for it. We actually had emailed Russell, and we had discussed about noticing it out so we can get it done at some point this month and have the public hearing perhaps, before the end of March, and adopt the resolution together, which would be, I think, a great achievement for the village and for the town working together. Gentlemen, did you have any questions for the DEC, for Carrie?
No, Carrie, it's my first, sit-in with you and with, the whole group here, the Conservancy. Thank you for doing all the work and all the people that are involved. And, as I stated in the last meeting, public meeting, that I've been on the outside of this. Jesse and Kimberly mostly have handled that and gotten communication from them and the other Clean Water Committee also. So obviously we're headed in a great direction with the town stepping in and wanting to, move on with this action plan too, and getting the meeting together with them is going to be a great step. And as soon as we can get that, we can get some of these, short-term projects going. So I think we're on a good path right now.
No, I concur. I mean, I think this is something that, from going to a couple of meetings back last spring, to where we are today has really been transformational. And I think that the people up here all are in favor of it. It sounds like the town is, in favor of it. And now it's just how can we all come together? I think having you is very helpful, especially with getting permitting and all of that, because I'm sure that's a very time-consuming. and laborious job. But I think that we are moving in the right decision. As you know, Mark said, we're not in the right decision, right direction. You know, as Mark said, this is really my first time being able to sit in and have a conversation with you. A little bit more public than I think anyone assumed, but
Right.
fine, great. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, being able to ask the questions, being able to get the answers, being able to know it and see it. I think it's all wonderful. So I think we're going in the right direction. I don't think that there's any, you know, major roadblocks from any one of us sitting up here from the village standpoint. So, and I think that the joint public hearing with town and village to hear what the public has to say and stuff, because, you know, the one nice thing is that, you know, everyone is like, oh, not in my backyard, but
Right.
there are a lot of people on the Lake Agawam Conservancy that are like, yes, please, in my backyard, come and do this. So that's always a good thing.
Great. So, yeah, David, you
I'll
want?
just come up, I want you to stay up here, Carrie.
Oh, you want to?
I just know I have to speak in front of the mic. With the momentum, Andrew, that you and Mark have talked about, there's a tremendous opportunity for funding sources for this that we haven't seen before, given that we have all the stakeholders working together, the momentum in Albany. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the funding potential and some deadlines.
Oh, yeah, sure. So one of the important things with getting the action plan adopted sooner rather than later is we do have, typically the Regional Economic Development Council announces their next funding round, their annual funding round. Essentially, it's now everything goes through the consolidated funding application, the CFA process, and that typically opens up sometime in May, usually like the third week of May, and is due, the deadlines, it's usually due that last week in July or early August. Every it's slightly different, but around that time frame. So that's why it's important to make sure that we have this lined up. And then, of course, there are going to be, there might be some other opportunities. One of the things we know that if there's technologies that the state is interested in piloting, such as the ultrasonic device, we believe that if we get all the information and requests that we need in a timely fashion from the village and/or the town, whoever's going to be the lead, we should be able to piece together the funding to pilot those devices in Lake Agawam this season. So that would cut out that expense for the local community. And there we would just want the consultant or whoever develops your more detailed HABs mitigation plan just on those technologies to identify for us which particular sonic device, because there are several manufacturers of ultrasonic devices. We want to make sure that the recommendation was in line with what your consultant or the village or town had selected. And is there anything else, David? Okay.
Karen, my only question I have remaining at this point is, can you just talk about the permitting process, about the timeline, and what we need to do in order to get permitting, whether it's for those technologies or for other technologies that we'd like to explore?
So the first thing would be to have to get a consultant on board who could quickly develop this HABs mitigation plan. And I actually do have outlines of that I can give you, kind of what that would include. But the key is, it would be, this is the treatment methodology or technology that we're recommending in this time frame, in this manner. Here's the quality assurance plan. Here's how the sampling analysis is going to be done. So that will, and then we approve that. That would then determine what permits you would need. So do you need a pesticide permit from us? Do you need a freshwater wetland permit? It depends. So something like the hydrogen peroxide would need a pesticide permit and a freshwater wetland permit, whereas the ultrasonic device should just need a freshwater wetland permit. So, or maybe not at all, but most likely it's going to have to be tethered to something. It's going to be anchored somehow so that it's not just completely all over the place. So we need that. And I think, guys, is there anything else I'm missing that we had talked about? Oh, possibly. We have to look into that because this is a new thing for us. There might be something like a floating object permit. I know it sounds weird to be like the UFO permit. Right. Yes, again, because some of this is new to us as well when we haven't deployed these technologies widely, when we're still piloting it in New York State. We want to make sure. So again, that first piece is the more detailed HABs mitigation plan, saying that the community is behind testing out this methodology, this treatment in this fashion, and then we would work with you on what permits are needed. And we can make that, I mean, you know, especially because we want to make sure that we're addressing harmful algal blooms, meaning it's a commitment of Governor Cuomo and New York State DEC. We will work very expeditiously with you guys. You just have to get us the right information. People always think that permits get like slowed down in DC. It's usually because people don't submit the correct information. So yeah, that's it. I mean, we think we could definitely have this all in place for this, you know, for this season. We just need to keep things moving along and keep the momentum going, because this is this season and we're going to have the action plan in place, and then we need the momentum to keep going, that we'll keep working together, because short term is 0 to 3, midterm 3 to 5, long term 5 to 10. So for at least 10 more years, you know, we got to be working on all this.
But if the grant isn't due until the end of July, right? Funding comes when from those grants?
It would be for the next
It would be for the
cycle.
next.
Usually those are announced in December. Usually it's that first week in December, second week in December, that the REDC, Regional Economic Development Council, funding round grants are announced. So you would be spending it, you know,
We
the
would be
following
spending
year.
for the following year.
Right.
So for this season,
For this year, someone would have to come up with funding for the hydrogen peroxide treatments. We believe the state could pull together funding to pilot the ultrasonic devices, because we want to see how that's going to work anyway as a possible solution statewide. And then what you would be identifying is if you wanted to go after grant funding for the other action items. So you'd say, we know we need more funding for, you know, floating islands or bioswale, something that you've identified in the plan and everyone gets behind, and then you go after that grant funding. And part of what you probably want to figure out as a community, big picture community, is what do you want to look for state funding? What do you want to try to get maybe CPF funding from the town? What is the Conservancy willing to do? What makes most sense for them to do? Where it might be harder to get grant funding, you'd want the private partnership. So.
And the consultant would be the point person amongst all these groups, and then would speak to you, or like the consultant's role would be trustees, village and town, Lake Agawam Conservancy, Clean Water.
It doesn't really matter who hires the consultant for that mitigation plan. Then what would have to happen, though, is the town trustees or the village, probably if it's something that's going to impact the Blake bottom sediments at all, so that would probably be the town trustees, right? Whereas if it was something where then they would apply for the permit from us. Whereas the village could apply maybe for the ultrasonic, because I guess if it attaches, I don't know if they'd be concerned if it attaches the bottom. We could work that out, but that might be a conversation between the village and the town to see which entity needs to apply for the permits. But the key thing, again, first is somebody needs to get a consultant on board that does lake management, that can quickly, and I'm not saying it's not a big thing. I can give you the outline. It's 3/4 of a page of bullets of what needs to be included in this. And all of the lake management consultants turn these things out quickly. They can turn it out in a week or two, if they know what they're doing. That would be the first step. And then we would figure out, okay, if you're doing hydrogen peroxide, it's probably the town trustees that need to get the pesticide and freshwater wetland permit from us. And for the ultrasonic, it's probably just the village. But if the town trustees have more of the wherewithal and are happy to apply, you may be just as happy letting them apply for the permits. So.
Right. Excellent. Thank you very much, Carrie. Thank you very much for everyone joining. Is there anyone else who'd like to make a comment?
Oh, yeah.
Gary Gillespie. I'm just curious on the hydrogen peroxide, if the town trustees allow it, do we have any kind of idea of budget? Do we know how much, or I guess it's maybe twice a summer you would do it, but do we have any quantities or?
Aren't you buying it at CVS?
It makes your teeth clean, right?
And Dr. Goldberg, while you're answering that, does someone do that? Is there,
Yes,
okay.
to do that,
yeah.
that has to be done. It's considered a pesticide, and so it has to be done by someone who's licensed by the DEC to do that. So for Roth Pond, we work with Solitude Lake Management. Their headquarters, I think, is in, I want to say New Jersey, at least the people we dealt with.
And they just took over a local company.
Oh.
So they have.
Yeah, sorry,
Oh,
Carrie.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and our understanding is that they just took over a local company on Long Island, so that they also have local pesticide applicators as well now in their as part of their team, because that was a problem for them in doing treatments on Long Island, is that they didn't necessarily have as many, local folks.
And I'll just finishing up on that, Gary. So we've been speaking to them. We've been also speaking to the regional distributor of the hydrogen peroxide. So it's actually, hydrogen peroxide is actually, we're using the term hydrogen peroxide. It turns out that's not actually permitted. It's something called green clean, which is mainly made of hydrogen peroxide, and it's made of a second product that decomposes into hydrogen peroxide, sort of stabilizes it. And a company called BioSafe from Connecticut is the regional distributor for that. We've also been talking to them because we think that we can, and when I say we, it's actually just me and my graduate student. But we think the product can get here. They can ship it directly to either Southampton or to the lake, and then Solitude would just then have to apply it, and that could cut down costs. But we know the concentrations that we'd want to use, and they're actually dictated on the label as well. And with regards to frequency, at least twice. What we learned from the prior go round is that you want to get ahead of it, so earlier in the season is better. Once the bloom gets going, you knock it back a little bit, but not all the way. And we definitely, definitely wouldn't want to, as I mentioned earlier to other people, we definitely want to couple it with the hydrosonic, because we think, my sense is that it won't be enough on its own to give the result we want. But that there could be some potential with both of the approaches. Both approaches are supposed to be selectively knocking back the blue-green algae and promoting other types of algae that are better for the food web. So we're hoping that there's some synergy and it gives an even better outcome. So I don't know if that answers all your questions. We don't have all the answers, but that's some of the...
Just a ballpark cost, do you have any idea? Question up the microphone.
The question was ballpark cost. I'm just going to say tens of thousands of dollars, but I don't have. We're still roughing it out. So.
Of course, we have like about $3,000 per acre.
Okay.
Can you repeat that, though?
So so the estimate by Karen Steinbrook from the DEC was $3,000 an acre.
At a high dose.
At a high dose, yeah. But I do think we would want a relatively high dose, just given the intensity of the blooms. Although the important thing is also that, so I had a student who did his master's on this. What we learned is that you want, that the optimal outcome is rather than, in Europe they had, the European recommendations was just a singular dose and don't go above that dose because you could have collateral effects. But the research we're doing actually suggests that you want your dose to match what's going on in the lake at that time. And so if you just use a blanket dose, it won't be strong enough, and it'll be dissipated very quickly by the existing algae. So whereas if you know the levels of the algae, you can actually make the dose relative to the amount of, for example, chlorophyll in the lake. So.
And Chris, we would need to, we might as well look, and we don't need to treat the whole lake.
Yeah.
So the
Repeat
lake
that.
is 64 acres, but it doesn't mean that you're going to treat,
Yeah, so the idea, we wouldn't necessarily treat the entire lake. We might just say focus on the northern end of the lake. In fact, DEC, I believe, restrictions indicate you should only treat half of the lake at a time. But you might treat half one day and half the next day. Within Lake Agawam, the blooms are most intense during the summer at the north end because of the winds off the ocean that sort of concentrate things there. But last fall we saw the winds reverse, and then we had a bloom concentrate at the southern end. So anyway, I think to be most effective, you might want to have, say, back-to-back or same-week doses for the whole lake, though, because of how prolific the blooms have been historically in Lake Agawam. So. Good questions.
And just to add to that, Gary, that's why it's so important to have a consultant who kind of lays that all out very clearly and says, we believe, based on the information we have about Lake Agawam, that if you're going to use Green Clean, this is the amount you would need and the treatment you would need and the timing, and et cetera and so forth. That's that HABs mitigation plan that we then look at and say, yes, we agree, or no, we disagree, it needs to be tweaked. before we would, give it our seal of approval, which would then lead to the permitting, which would then lead to implementation.
I guess if that's the case and we're $3,000 an acre, roughly 200,000 to cover the entire lake, for one, thing, we do it twice a year, that's 400,000 plus whatever the corporate company's going to cost us and stuff. I mean, is that something this year that the Lake Agawam Conservancy would consider funding, considering, we know that our grant writing is going to kick in at a later stage?
Well, we can certainly consider part of that. Again, we want to make sure that we're all doing this in partnership on all these different steps. So to the degree we can put together a portfolio of funding from the town, the village, and the Conservancy, I think we can probably get there, but not solely on our own, no.
So just so you know, I'm handing out copies of this is like a draft for a HABs mitigation plan outline. It's not even 3, it's like half a page, so if you want to.
We can put one up on the,
Put one up.
we can put, yeah, we can there, or,
Up in this here, so you guys see what you're talking about.
Thank you very much.
And I can email this to you as well. I can't remember who I sent stuff to now. So. Anything, so.
Yeah, we have,
Any other
I think this was
questions?
emailed to.
Was it? Yeah, I thought, I didn't know who I'd emailed to. I just have to find somewhere, there's I thought this was the button. There's an eject button here, so, oh, here we go. Okay. It's not letting me. Technology. Yes, okay, now we'll try again. But the battery didn't die. That's a plus. The battery on our morning session died. Not this. The other meeting I was here for this morning. I've been in Southampton all day. So is Chris. You're always here.
Well, so suppose the village were to partner with the Conservancy 50/50 for the hydrogen peroxide plan. Do we have money in our budget for this, and what line item would it come from?
Yeah, I think that we'd want to give some thought to maybe a combination of areas that we may want to do this, but, certainly the village does put aside about $1 million a year for capital expenditures, so no change in our budget, gives us $1 million, which obviously there are other projects that we need to deal with. Certainly the village has other opportunities as well. It has, money in its fund balance that, if the village thinks that's important. And again, we may decide on some of the other things that we use that capital budget for, that we may want to, borrow money for some things that we traditionally, spend cash on. So I think it's a combination of, obviously this is going to be a much larger project over time. So I think we need to kind of put a larger budget together and then consider our best sources for funding. Whether it be a combination of borrow and or expenditure of capital reserves.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? If not, we can conclude this meeting. So thank you very much. I just wanted to thank Carrie Gallagher and the entire DEC team. You've been incredibly committed to the village of Southampton and the town of Southampton. I know you have a lot of territory to cover. So we really appreciate you taking the entire day to be here with us, and for the number of other meetings that you've attended and led, and then for also conducting the initial pilot program with us for the algae skimmer. Wanted to thank Dr. Gobler, wanted to thank the Clean Water Committee, and especially wanted to thank the Lake Agawam Conservancy, Megan, Fernanda, David, and everyone else who's come out. Serena, thank you very much. Pat, thank you. And it's been a great pleasure to work both with public and private entities in order to solve and attack this problem that we've known has existed for a very long time. So we are really appreciative of the tremendous momentum that we have and the great turnout. So with that said, we can make a motion to adjourn.
For a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. All right. Thank you again.
Thank you.